For that, only deflection, editing, misunderstanding, incomplete pictures. And David answered with calm certainty, when multiple people describe the same emotional experience, it becomes a pattern. And Christine did not convince anyone. She stopped protecting an image that was never protecting her. And that truth left Cody cornered. And when he said David was not there, did not understand what it was really like, David simply said he knew what it was like when he met her. And that was enough, because the present told the story the past could not change. And as the conversation slipped further from Cody's control, he shifted again into authority mode, speaking of leadership roles and hard calls and burden, and how without him the family would not have existed. And David reframed that too, saying leadership is measured by how people feel inside the structure, not by how long it stands. And when Cody demanded acknowledgement for surviving a system he helped design, David said gratitude does not work that way, and apologies are not currency. They are accountability, offered without expectation. And that silence that followed was heavy, because Cody was no longer being challenged as an ex-husband, but as a man whose identity was built on authority without reflection. And then Cody made the mistake that sealed the shift. He said David only knew a honeymoon version of Christine, and that life would get hard and then David would understand. And in that moment, projection replaced reflection, and David responded with grounded certainty that suffering does not justify absence, that love is proven by presence, not endurance, and that complexity amplifies responsibility rather than excusing it. And when he said that if you cannot meet that responsibility, you need to examine your life and your management of it, the room changed, because that was not a debate, it was a boundary. And when Cody launched into complaints of disrespect and disloyalty, David ended it with a single phrase: Christine stopped sacrificing herself for Cody's image. And that truth sat there unmovable because it reframed everything. Christine was not dramatic, she was done. And Cody's apology meeting had become something else entirely, a mirror he did not ask for and was not ready to face. What if the apology you waited years to hear wasn't really an apology at all, but a last attempt to control the story? This meeting was supposed to be simple: one room, two men, and closure. Instead, it became something far more uncomfortable. A quiet confrontation where excuses unraveled, power shifted, and the truth no one wanted to say out loud finally had nowhere left to hide. And once the first sentence landed, there was no walking it back, because this wasn't about the past anymore. It was about who really moved on and who never did. Cody Brown walked into that Las Vegas room believing he was walking toward closure, believing that a few carefully chosen words and a controlled tone would be enough to shift the narrative he had been carrying for years. But from the moment he sat down across from David Woolley, something subtle but irreversible began to change. Because this was not a man seeking validation, not a man looking for approval, and not a man desperate to rewrite history. David was calm, grounded, and unmoved by the weight Cody brought with him, and that imbalance set the stage for everything that followed. Because Cody was used to being the loudest voice, the emotional center, the authority figure whose feelings shaped the direction of every conversation. But here, that power no longer applied, and Cody felt it even before a single apology was spoken. The room was quiet in a way that did not offer comfort. It was the kind of silence that forces honesty, and Cody filled it the way he always does, with explanation, with framing, with context that leans just close enough to accountability to sound sincere, while never fully landing there. He spoke about regret, about pain, about how things went wrong with Christine, and how emotions were high during the breakup. And on the surface, it sounded like progress, but underneath every sentence carried the same familiar rhythm, a subtle centering of himself, a gentle reminder that he too was a victim of circumstance and pressure and misunderstanding. And David listened without nodding, without interrupting, without offering the relief Cody unconsciously expected. Because when an apology is accepted, the air shifts, and here it stayed heavy. And when David finally spoke, It was not with anger or accusation, but with clarity. He said that apologies stop working when they are followed by reasons, and in that moment, something fractured, because Cody was not prepared to be held to that standard by someone who did not fear him, did not need him, and did not depend on him. David was not there to debate the past. He was there to protect the present, and that distinction mattered more than Cody realized. Because while Cody spoke about intention, David spoke about impact. And while Cody tried to explain his mindset, David grounded the conversation in outcomes and the reality Christine lived long after the marriage ended. David spoke about the woman he met, kind, cautious, warm but guarded, someone who questioned her own worth, someone who carried the echo of years spent feeling unseen. And those words landed heavier than any accusation, because they did not attack Cody, they exposed the costs of his behavior. And Cody responded the only way he knew how, by defending his struggle, by insisting he did his best, by reminding the room that plural marriage was complicated, that responsibility was heavy, that leadership required hard choices, and that not everyone could be happy all the time. But David did not argue structure. He talked about presence. He said that being overwhelmed does not excuse emotional absence, and that leadership without care is not leadership at all. And as the conversation deepened, it became clear that Cody wanted shared blame, and David refused to offer it, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity, because Christine had already paid the price for that confusion for years. Cody began to shift in his seat, crossing his arms, tightening his tone, reframing the story again and again, trying to pull Christine back into the role of someone who failed to communicate, who pulled away, who stopped prioritizing him. And David met each claim with quiet resolve. He said Christine did communicate, she just stopped believing she was heard, and that there is a difference between silence and resignation. And when he said that, the narrative Cody clung to began to unravel. Because resignation is not rebellion, it is survival, and Cody could not sit with that truth without confronting his own role in it. The room felt smaller then, not physically, but emotionally, because every path Cody tried to take led back to the same place, a pattern of control disguised as responsibility, a demand for loyalty framed as respect. And when David said that respect is not obedience, but mutual consideration, something shifted permanently, because that single sentence stripped power from Cody's definition of authority and replaced it with something Cody had rarely offered: consistency, safety, and presence. Cody spoke about sacrifice, about what he provided, about security and identity, and David acknowledged those things without granting them immunity. Because providing does not cancel neglect, and holding a family together does not mean the people inside it felt whole. And when David compared that structure to a house that stands while the people inside feel small and afraid to speak, the metaphor lingered, because it did not accuse, it revealed. And Cody bristled, insisting he was respected, insisting he was not some tyrant. And David did not label him one. He simply said that compliance born from fear of disruption is not trust, and that people often leave emotionally long before they leave physically. And that truth hung between them, because Christine's absence was no longer a mystery, it was evidence. And as Cody continued to speak, his words grew faster, his sentences longer, tangled with frustration, because the meeting was no longer following his script. This was not a redemption moment, it was a reckoning. And when Cody finally said that Christine's happiness seemed performative, that she was rewriting history, that she was trying to prove something, David's demeanor changed, not with anger, but with resolve, because questioning her joy crossed a line. And David responded that Christine does not need to perform happiness. She recognizes it because she lived without it for so long. And then he said something that stopped Cody cold. He said Christine does not talk about Cody the way Cody thinks she does. She does not sit in bitterness. She does not relive the past. She builds peace. And that contrast was impossible to ignore. Because while Cody was still fighting the ending, Christine had already moved forward, and David was not boasting, he was explaining. Closure looks different when it's real. And Cody reacted by reaching for a familiar defense, claiming Christine embarrassed him, turned the kids against him, made everything public. And David listened and then asked the question that dismantled the argument. Did you ever ask why so many people believed her? And belief is not loyalty, it is recognition. And Cody had no answer. The moment David said that Christine stopped sacrificing herself for Cody image, the air in the room changed in a way that could not be undone. Because that sentence reframed years of blame and confusion into a single, undeniable truth. And Cody felt it, even if he refused to accept it. Because for the first time, the story was no longer about who failed whom, it was about who benefited from silence and who paid the price for keeping the peace. And Cody sat there searching for a way back to control, because control had always been his anchor when emotions got uncomfortable. But David was no longer engaging in emotional negotiation. He was standing firm in reality, and reality did not bend to Cody framing. Cody tried again, shifting the language, softening his tone, saying, relationships are complicated, saying, nobody is perfect, saying, everyone plays a role. And David let him finish, because interruption was never the point, accountability was. And when David spoke again, he did not counter with anger, he countered with consistency. He said, complexity does not blur responsibility, it sharpens it. And that when someone holds more power, their margin for error gets smaller, not larger, because impact scales with authority. And that was a truth Cody had avoided for years, because it dismantled the idea that his intentions alone could absolve him. David spoke about presence again, about how showing up emotionally is not a gesture, but a pattern, and how love that feels conditional trains people to suppress themselves rather than speak honestly. And as he spoke, it became clear that this meeting was never about forgiveness. It was about recognition, recognizing what actually happens beneath the noise of excuses and justifications. Cody reacted the way he always does when recognition threatens identity. He reframed himself as misunderstood, as unappreciated, as burdened. And he spoke about the weight of expectations, about being pulled in too many directions, about being responsible for too many people at once. And David acknowledged the weight without allowing it to excuse the harm, because carrying weight does not mean you get to drop it on others. And that sentence landed quietly but firmly, because it stripped away the martyr narrative Cody leaned into. Cody spoke about loyalty, about how families require sacrifice. And David clarified that sacrifice without consent becomes obligation, and obligation without care becomes resentment. And resentment does not disappear, it accumulates, and eventually it walks out the door. And Cody shifted again, questioning whether Christine truly communicated, whether she truly tried, whether she truly understood what was being asked of her. And David met that with certainty, saying understanding is not agreement. And Christine understood enough to know she was shrinking. And that realization does not come suddenly. It comes after years of unmet needs and ignored boundaries. And that is when Cody's frustration became visible,